Trying very hard to learn. That's what we're doing. But we're learning like this. We're learning, let's just read it. Anyone, I'm turning in chapter 4. Anyone is going to engage in inquiry about these, what are these? The parts of the soul, right? That's what we're engaged in an inquiry. That's first. We're engaged in an inquiry. Inquiry. Something called engagement. Like you gotta be engaged in it. Last. Okay. Anyways, no, seriously. Yeah, we have to first know what it is, and then find out what follows. That's what it says here. What that means is in Yiddish is that we discussed that already, right? The correct way of knowing anything is to know what it is. That's the only question that anyone ever asked. The Socrates walked around and asked everyone the question, what is it? Anything someone said, he'd say, could you tell me what it is? And the guy would try to say something, and he would say, well, what would you do if something and something? And say, oh, it's not that. So what is it, right? So we're always looking for the definition of things, or for the essence of things. And the point of knowing the essence of things is supposed to be that explains what follows from them, right? So why do people stuff? Because they're people, and that's just the empty formula, right? But if you want to be able to understand what it means to be a people, to be a person, then that has to be a kind of definition that logically almost, or definitionally explains why people do people stuff, and all the other things that follow.
About having the guidepost versus this is more the discussion having a correct premises, right? Correct premise.
Sort of, but the premise is not a logical premise only. It's a real premise. It's a logical premise, meaning to say it's the thing that causes that to be the way it is.
Meaning, if I consider Lowy and a rock to, in some sense, be the same, then for the purposes, we're going to find out things about bodies, but we're not going to necessarily find out things about people.
Yeah, and then you would know then you would be able to explain the body kind of things that they do. Bodies have certain ways that they act because, well, you have to understand because of what bodies are. That's always it goes back to. Same thing, souls, people, living things do certain things. Whole list of things we've discussed, right? Life means a lot of different things. It means eating and growing, and it means reproduction, it means sensing, and it means thinking. At least those things, in the most general terms. Maybe it means wanting. All of these things. What is life? Isn't that what all the people want to know? What is life? This is the Shaila. What is life? So if we would know what it is, then we'll be able to explain why it does these things. That's the goal, really. That's how every science is supposed to look at the end. Okay? But what he's trying to say now is he's going back to one of his methodological points and trying to say how we're going to find that out. And of course we could say in the most general terms, a living soul is the form of a living thing, or all of these things. But that's just the most general thing. Now we got this whole list of things what life is. We need to really explain each of them, right? What is perception? What is growth and nutrition? What is thinking, right? So we need to, example, if you want to understand the intellectual soul, right, the thinking soul, you're going to have to explain, we're going to have to explain what thinking is, or what that thing that thinks is, and then we'll understand how it thinks or why it thinks, right? So that's sort of the goal. That's always the goal of everything. We want to know the essence of things, and which then explains their properties and explains everything else. But the question is how we get to this. It's always the question, how we get to this. So he says something very important, and very important for his method in this whole thing. He says, but let's I'm reading in the third line here. If we must say what each of them is, for example, what is the faculty of thought, or of perception, or of nutrition, right? Faculty meaning the power, the thing that does thinking, right? We want to know what that is. We would have to say what thinking is, right? So in other words, he has set up these two things right now. Number one, firstly, right? We have thinking, and there's something that does the thinking. We're just saying that in order to understand the doing the thinking, or what he calls the activity of thinking, you would have to understand what the thing that thinks is, and therefore you'll understand why it thinks or how it thinks, right? But there's a problem here. There's some kind of problem. It's not a loop, but we have to really go in the other direction. What he's trying to say is in order to understand it. because the power to think, which is called thought, or the soul, the intellectual soul, only makes sense, is only defined by what thinking is, right? If you don't know what thinking is, you're never going to know what. Of course, in reality, the explanation of thinking would be because this is a thinking thing, so it thinks, right? That's what it seems to be. Might seem to be that correct order. That might seem to be the correct order of things. But at least in the order of us thinking about it, and actually you might think that in the real order also, I'm not sure about this, because we always remember there's a different order of how things are and how we get to them, right? At least in the way of we getting to them, possibly also in the way things are. Because if you understand that what the faculty of thought is only the faculty for thinking, right? So if anyone doesn't agree that thinking is a thing, he won't need a faculty of thought. This is important, right? We'll see that this is really what makes the whole difference of the way he thinks and the way other people would think. Because if there's no such a thing as thought, then there's no power of thinking. There's a power for something else, right? For example, if thought reduces to imagination, which is one of the ways he says things, right? Let's say I'm not talking about thought right now, let's talk about thought for a second. What is thought? Well, now he goes one more step. Let me finish his 3 steps. He says, okay, but it basically makes sense, right? The definition of the power to think is that it's able to think. That's the thing that's able to think, right? The power, the faculty, whatever you want to call it. The can think, the potential for thinking, right? That only makes sense. That's defined by what thinking is, right? It's not the power for eating, it's the power for thinking. And the same thing for the power for eating is the power for eating and not the power for thinking, right? So there isn't like you want to explain the thinking by the power, but it's really backwards. You need to explain the power by what it is, right? What the activity is. So if you don't have a clear idea of what the activity is, we're never really going to find this is the power for doing it, the thing that does it. And then he goes one step further and he says that how do we think of what the activity is? The way we think of what the activity is by the object.
Is there, when we have something like this, where you have a connection being made between the thing known and the person knowing?
Wait, we're now, yeah, then?
I'm saying, is this like the question of where to start?
Yeah, but it's like I was saying, it's not only where to start, it's also what kind of thing we're looking for.
Are you pointing out, I'm not sure what you're trying to say. Are you saying something about like looking at the particulars like of a thing to get to what it is and then somehow go back to that to what the particulars
if we have 3 things, he's setting up a picture where there's 3 things. Okay? Mm-hmm. There are powers to do things, which are the soul, really. What we usually call the soul is the power to do something, right? The ability, the capacity, the faculty to think. Okay? There is thinking, which is an activity, right? It's a thing that we do. It's a doing. It's a kind of activity. And then there's thinking. Thinking is of something. And actually eating, everything is of something. Those are the 3 things. You've got the power, the activity, and the object. Object meaning, because he says, and what he says in this paragraph is,
that which thinking is about, right?
The capacity is only the capacity for thinking. So you can't have a capacity which is somehow thinks without it being for thinking, without us knowing what thinking is. Let's talk about how we know it, right? We can't know what it is. And when we ask me what thinking is, right? We'll say, well, thinking is how did I say last week? Thinking is the connection between you and intelligible objects. That's very important. Because the only thing that makes different, that's important. The only difference between thinking, for example, and perceiving, or between perceiving and eating, is that they connect with different objects. They have different things that they correlate to. That's how he says it, right? They have different objects. In other words, thinking is of thinkable things, thoughts, or the intelligible parts of the world. Or perceiving, right? It's easier to talk about perception, right? Because that's one that everyone agrees with, right? If you want to talk about the ability to see color, right? So you got 3 things: the ability to see color, right? That's what perception of color is, right? It's all these 3 things together, of course. But if you want to explain what it is, and you say, well, it's some kind of ability, I'm going to say the ability for what? So you say, yeah, for seeing color. So what do you mean for seeing color? How is seeing color different than seeing, let's say we could see something else. Aristotle thinks we can only see color.
Shapes.
Let's say we can see shapes also. We can't really. But let's say we see shapes also, maybe we do. Then I'll ask you, so what's the difference between seeing color and seeing shapes? We say, well, this one is about color. It's what it's about, right? Or the real Aristotelian way of saying it is it's what its end is, right? What it's for. It's towards its intention. Its kavana is the thing that it sees, the color. So the ability to see color only makes sense after you know what color is. in other words, the object of this of this activity. The object of this activity is color. The seeing color has color as its object, and therefore, in order to understand it, we sort of have to go backwards, or at least we have to remember to include this. We have to explain what the thing that it sees is, what color is. And then we'll be able to understand what the activity of seeing is, and then, of course, the capacity would be the capacity for doing that, for seeing color. And in the same way, thinking, you would have to know. Right? So he says, if you were to say what the faculty of thought is, or perception of nutrition, we have to say what thinking or perceiving is. For activities are in respect of a definition. In respect of a definition, meaning in thinking, right? In respect of definition means in thinking and thought, prior to their potentialities. Right? And if this so, we can go one step toward. Prior to them, we should have considered their correlative objects. So we should, for the same reason, determine first. So before we discuss anything, we need to know what nourishment and what the object, in other words, food. What is food? We need to know what food is before we know what eating is, and before we know what the capacity for growing through eating is, which is nourishment. Same way, we need to know what the objects of perception are before we know what perception is and what the soul of perception is, and so on and so forth. For all these three things, this is a very important thing, because what this means is, I think that what it means is that if you don't believe, for example, if you don't think there's such a thing as such an object, then you're not going to find such a faculty ever. We tend to, in modern ways of thinking, tend to reduce things to their capacities, right? So seeing is something that some capacity of doing something. And then ask you, okay, but what is color? I don't know. Color is the thing that we see, but that doesn't work, because then what is the thing? Or in the same way, thinking or intellect is just some kind of movement within the soul, some kind of thing a person does. And say, okay, and what is the difference between intellect and perception, or something like that? And you say, well, it's a different thing that a person does. So there's no real difference, right? Then we don't have intellect, because there's no objects of intellect. If there's no object, in other words, for example, I would say, you would say that later, intellect is, what is the difference between thinking and imagining, for example? Can you tell me a difference? How could you show the difference of something like that?
Imagination doesn't. I can imagine a dog with four heads.
Okay, then what's the problem with that?
Those don't exist in the world.
Okay, so it's only the world. So in other words, it's only the truth, the objective truth of things that makes a difference between thinking and imagining, right? Right? So now, what this means that...
Is that where the word objective comes from?
Yeah. Yeah, objective, actually, I think there's some linguistic mess up with what objective means, because it used to mean the opposite, but I don't know. Point is...
Because the way you're saying it makes sense.
Subjective also is about a subject.
I guess. Yeah.
Right, that's the problem. And in linguistic, in grammar, subject is the object, you know. Right. Anyways, something like this. So what I'm saying is, in other words, now you're saying something very interesting, right? But you realize what you just did, because you're saying magic. So if I go around and saying, a human being has got a piece of himself, part of his soul, right? Sounds very mystical, whose definition is that it knows the truth. It knows the difference between true things and false things. In other words, things that exist and things that don't exist. That's what truth means, by the way, not form of truth, right? Truth. And you'll tell me, well, that sounds like magic. Like, how would we know that? Right? It seems it's magical to most people nowadays, I think. Maybe it is. But if there's such a thing as thought, and if you start from the objects of thought, you say, so you do agree that there are things that we know, and things that we don't know. In other words, there are objects of thought and objects that are not objects of thought. Maybe there are things that can't be known. They can only be seen, which is not the same thing as knowing. Then there must be, how do we know it, right? There must be a corresponding faculty of knowing truth. So it's from going through the object that we find out that there's such a thing. If you go backwards, at least it seems over here that you're not going to have, there's no way to get the definition of knowing being different from anything else. Because just potential for connecting with things, potential for, okay, but what defines it is something outside of it, right? What defines it is its object. So the object, and we're starting here all the way down, all the way from nourishment. In order to know what growth is, you need to know what food is. And food is not the same as matter. Very interesting. That's why I realized I have to go back to starting here. I'm going to try to read it inside. Food is not the same thing as like matter. You would think that food is just a material thing, but it's not. Because... And this is why we go back. This is what makes it make sense to say that we have a nutritive soul and not just a machine that pushes Cheerios into your stomach and makes you fat.
What is food?
And we'll get to this.
Okay.
That's the other option.
That's
That's what most people think nowadays, right? You got this crusher, it crushes Cheerios, and then somehow the Cheerios are here, right?
Yeah.
And to him, that's false, because Cheerios are different than racks, and racks are not food. Why are racks not food? They seem to have, well, somewhat are minerals, somewhat kind of food, but to the extent that they're not, because they can't become you. So there's some kind of difference between eating and growing in the physical sense. So that's already a concept. That's an idea almost, and that's the nutritive soul. Why not only a nutritive body, and the same thing for everything else.
Is this connected to this conversation of perception you had a couple weeks ago? That if you know the object, you obviously perceive the object. You actually perceive it.
Yeah. But this is the correct way. I think that was based on this more than this is based on that. This is his way. His way of saying that what we just said. The capacity is defined by the activity, and the activity is defined by the object. This is the way of thinking. In other words, the object is part of the definition here. We don't have this like what is a different law from? It's different from, we seem to tend to think that it's enough to just think about the capacity somehow. And we could say, well, we know that directly. We have all these ideas, like Cartesian ideas and so on. But those are not his ideas. His ideas which are very simple. I think it's very simple. It seems to make sense to me without comparing it to other things. It seems to make a lot of sense that you can't talk about what the capacity for eating is without knowing what eating is. And you can't explain what eating is without knowing what eating does to. Like, what is the object of eating, right? The object of eating is food. So you got to explain what food is. And then it sounds circular. Well, food is the thing you eat. Okay. But that's just showing you that you need to include the object in the story. You have to start from the object.
Are these things correct because they're circular? Maybe says that they're because they actually are.
Yeah, I don't think they're circular. In other words, they're circular. It depends on how you. They're really all the same. He's going to end up saying that the soul is all of these things. I don't know if they're circular.
They seem circular. I'm not sure if they actually are. I'm not going to say.
In other words, actually, the way he thinks usually is something like this. Actually, in the sense of in time, you have a capacity before you have the object, right? Because a person, for example, is born with eyes before he sees. So he has some kind of capacity. Well, it's only a potential capacity because of his ways of thinking. But he has, remember he says there's a difference between every boy can be a general and a soldier can be a general. Those are two different kinds of cans. But in any case, there's still a can before. So there's still in every case, there's a capacity before. But that's sort of only in time. In definition, it's really backwards. In reality, in other words, what he calls the order of nature, really the object is before. So there is, you sort of could say from God's perspective or from the perspective of reality, there is food, and therefore there is eating, and therefore there are people that can eat. But I don't need God's perspective. I can give you for the definitional perspective, it's like that. And the logical perspective, it's like this. Because nobody can explain me what the capacity for eating is without telling me what food is. And if you try, which is what reductionism tries to do, and Empedocles tried to do people a long time ago. If you try, you end up ignoring usually you end up not answering the question that was asked.
You don't explain the relationship between the eating.
Exactly. You end up explaining something else, and then you end up not explaining eating, and then explaining something else, and explaining away the relationship that exists between the thing and its object. Right? You say, well, I don't know if there's such a thing as an object of thought, and then thinking, I don't know. Maybe there's just
objects that go into other objects.
No, well, that's well thought, but maybe there's just some movie going on in your head. But then thank you very much, but that's not what I asked you to explain. You just told me that what I asked you to explain doesn't exist. That's a general shtick with modern science, where they just pretend to answer your questions and they just say that the question doesn't exist. Anyway, that's not our class now. I'm just trying to. My whole mahalach is that since we might as well, one of my things is that instead of taking drugs, which tell you things that makes no sense, might as well try to think thoughts that made sense to people once upon a time, which makes at least as much sense as drugs. Even more sense. And then we could start to. And they basically make sense. Now you could come and build up a whole theory that stops it making sense, but the reason they're circular is because they're trying to show you what you think yourself, right?
That's what I'm saying. It's very.
They're supposed to be doing that.
It's very local. It doesn't bring in anything else because you're trying to explain it. So that's why it shouldn't bring in anything else, because you should explain. But
all of this is trying to lead us is to the soul. In other words, to what he calls the form, right? Or the first actuality, the fact that it's not enough to have a entirely material explanation of things or mechanistical explanation of things. It's very deliberately what he's doing, although he's not as non-materialistic, so to speak, as Plato and so on. But he still very clearly is telling you that you need to have these concepts or these ideas or these, however you call them, the souls, what he calls the soul. Right? And then he gives the exact explanation of what I mean by the soul. That's why he's not just saying, well, it's the soul that did it. Because the soul is just the name that we call for
the ability.
Well, he's going to say for all of these four things. For the cause and the ability and the goal. For all those three things. But only one thing that's not the soul, which is the body, which is the matter. So we're going to read this, okay?
But 1 second, the soul includes the object perceived.
In some way. Well, after it's potentially, and the end in some way.
Something that's perceived, meaning.
Yeah, somehow. It's the end. No, it's not. Well, he's going to try to say something about that. And in what sense the soul includes its object. We're going to get to that.
Does he need the object to be potentially soul?
Yeah, exactly. It potentially includes its object, and the object is potentially a soul. And includes it in that way. There's another way in which it includes, which it's not entirely part of it, but we'll get to that.
Same way food is potentially. It's like in a parallel.
Wait, let's read it. So that's the thing. So the first thing I think that's behind you. I don't have your paper. I think the first sentence here is just saying that we need to start with the object. This is very interesting because it makes you start from like the furthest thing from like here, the furthest thing from like the most abstract thing, sort of. What? This is a pen. A highlighter? I have also. There's highlighters. The object is the thing that makes sense from all these differences, right? Because the only difference in eating and thinking is that they're referred to different objects. Does that make sense? Eating and thinking are only different because you eat food and think thoughts. Otherwise, they're the same thing. They're both souls. No, I'm saying. No, because otherwise, could you explain what the difference is without saying that, without referring then to the object of it? I don't know. I think there's no way. They definitely thought.
Oh, that's the point.
Yeah, they do.
They consume the thoughts. No, I mean in terms of like destroying it.
Oh, eating doesn't destroy its object. Of course not. That's not eating. That's something else. Well, it eats it. It digests it. It makes it part of itself, which is what perception does and thought does.
Because also we're talking about the part of food that.
If we're talking about food, whatever is not food, that's not eating.
Not food.
Whatever goes to the bathroom, that's not eating. That's the part of eating that's broke, that's not eating.
So
right?
material rock that you're perceiving,
that just
not either part of what your thought is, so it's still there.
And we'll get to that, yeah, in some sense, partially. Okay, so hence, where am I? I want to try to read it, but I should have printed you this because I could do it. Hence, we have to speak first about nourishment and reproduction. Okay, so now that we have our klal, I think that's the first paragraph here, right? But we need to start with the objects. Now he goes back and he's starting, and this is like him working in his order, where we're going to start from the bottom and start talking about reproduction and nourishment. So that's interesting. So in other words, we discussed in most general terms that we have these three souls, the nutritive soul and the perceptive soul and the intellectual soul. Those are the three things that living things do, right? We discussed that there's different orders of living things, which some of them do only one, some of them do the other. This is all really to explain that in some way. But if we start with the thing that all living things do, or at least all mortal living things do, right? Which is they all have, this is what defines a living thing in this world, mortal ones, that they all have nourishment and reproduction. That's interesting, according to him. All living things do that. That's what makes them alive. That's what we mean. In other words, that's what we mean when we say they're alive. That they nourish and they reproduce. That's what he says. Where the nutritive soul belongs also to other living things. Now, there's nothing that you could call alive that doesn't do this. Do you have a counterexample? I don't have. Can you think of something that is alive and doesn't reproduce or nourish itself? Both, really?
A god? No.
Yeah, a god, but that's true. Where we earlier excluded immortal things. Gods are alive, but in a different sense. They're only alive and they only have intellectual souls, so to speak. But everything else, they also don't have matter, so it's a whole different story. Everything that's alive in our normal sense, things that have matter and form.
Do mushrooms reproduce?
They obviously reproduce, somehow. Mushrooms produce more mushrooms.
Comes from them.
Comes from somewhere. Doesn't come from nowhere.
Reproduction is coming from somewhere.
So listen.
If the generation, would that
Okay.
be reproducing?
What?
Spontaneous generation would be considered reproducible.
Okay, so
also?
he talks about this in the next paragraph. He's got three how do you call them? Siyugim, no? Three he gives us his like yetzim and aklal of things that don't reproduce. Well, all things would you agree they all have nutrition, right?
Okay.
They all but nutrition is just a way of saying life is that which sustains itself in some way, right? By food, by taking something in and staying what it is. That's really what nutrition means, right? That's
it also needs to be sustained. Like a rock doesn't need to be sustained.
Right. But life sustains itself, nourishes, and he connects reproduction to this. We need to understand why, but he thinks that it's sort of the same thing. Well, he's gonna explain. He's gonna explain why. Yeah, because reproduction is just another way of living things sustaining themselves, not by themselves but in species. So if life in the first level, in other words, like we said, what includes all life on Earth, all life is that they reproduce, that they sustain itself. That's what life is this kind of activity of sustaining itself. That's another way, if you think about what it means two things, nourishment and reproduction. Nourishment is for you, and reproduction is for you in the general sense, in the species sense, for your family, for your genes, however you call it. So he said like this, for Nuchtiv Sol belongs also to the other living things. So Nuchtiv Sol is what the higher things, right? Like the perceptive things and the moving things and intellectual things, they all have also the Nuchtiv Sol. And is the first and most commonly possessed potentiality of soul, in virtue of which all they have life. So in some sense, everything that we say is alive, we mean that he's alive because he has a nutrition and reproduction. Again, everything in this world, but everything that we say is alive because it has a Nuchtiv Sol. When your Nuchtiv Sol dies, you're not alive. Maybe you're still perceiving. That's not called alive. That's Nadam Haba or whatever. Not relevant. And then he says its function. So what does the Nuchtiv Sol do? Is two things: reproduction and the use of food. So the use of food is sort of obvious, I think. The reproduction is the one that he just introduced now. Like I don't think he spoke about it until now. And of course, he's not looking for like reproduction, like how does it work? You have sexual reproduction, asexual reproduction, and so on. But he's trying to show how reproduction is part of what it means to be alive, in this sense, right? There's bigger senses. He says, for it's the most natural function in living things. So the most natural thing, what living things do is reproduce. That's always his answer to these things. What does it do? What do living things do? Well, they live, right? Their living is a doing, right? What does that mean? What do they do? So in general, all living things do this. They grow up to a completion, right? We get introducing this idea. Everything starts off like being a baby, being an embryo, being a cell, or whatever it is. Most things, at least. And it grows until it reproduces. That's just what they do, and then they die. That's already not part of living. That's part of not living, right? But that's what they do. That's what it means by the natural function of living things as such as are perfect. In other words, everything grows to maturity and has babies. That's what all living things do. I don't even know if you thought that mushrooms are living things. I think that's a good question. But he's gonna talk about this. He always has like a paradigm case that he's thinking of, like an ant. Actually, he's not ant are like halfway living, like shvachamas according to him, but like a cat. Things he's always like a very valbatish thinking. Like the normal things are always the paradigms, like things that you can see. Cats, people, trees, dogs, cat, lions, whatever, all kinds of things like that. They're the paradigm example of living things, and all of them grow and reproduce. That is what we mean by living. Now you'll ask me, well, what if one is somehow not? Not everyone has children. Not every animal has children. Say that. That's when then he gives you a yitzchok and a klal, and not mutilated. That doesn't count. Because of course, like the natural, this is what people always get confused about. Like, okay, so you're not human if you don't reproduce. That's not the point. The point is that is what it wants to do. The thought of living sort of wants to. Again, wants is too many words. But that's what they all do. Well, yeah, some of them don't because they're broken. Okay, but that doesn't make that not the definition of life. It's sort of halfway alive. It's broken life. It's mutilated. It's missing some organs, or it's missing part of what makes it alive. But that's what life means. What life means, things that if it would stop, we would have no life. I mean, it's kind of obvious that life needs that. But it's not only it needs that, it sort of means that. And well, maybe some things don't reproduce. Something that has spontaneous reproduction generation, like mushrooms or whatever they thought has spontaneous generation. Maybe there's not really such things according to modern science. But Okay, so I'm not counting those. Those are not really animals. Those are not living things. That's what Chazal say. Some of that something that has spontaneous generation is not considered alive.
It's less than plants?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, of course. Because he sees that that's something that I sort of can't explain, so I ignore it. No, but the point is, it's something that's not doesn't have that. In other words, it has to be. He always looks at like the ideal case, right? The ideal case of a living thing is that it grows and it has babies, reproduces. Of course, sometimes it's got its balls cut off and it can't do it. Okay, well, that's it. That doesn't make it less the idea of a living thing to do that. Well, some things don't reproduce that way. Something just comes from the air. Okay, those are not the real living things either. Well, do they have life once they spontaneously generate? Yeah, some kind of life. But because of this, I think that he thinks that because of this, because they don't have this reproduction, they're less alive. Because he looks at all the living things, besides for a few weird things that spontaneously generate. Because they don't have order, they don't have like enough of a structure, like there's something messed up with them. Of course, they also have some explanation. So in that sense, you could say, maybe, I don't even know how he really thought spontaneous generation would work. It must come from somewhere. So in that sense, like the universe or whatever is alive in some general sense, it gets a soul from somewhere and so on. So it does have a soul, but it's not this soul. Because this thing doesn't sustain itself. And living means sustaining yourself. And we have to explain why sustaining yourself means sustaining yourself. You have to sustain yourself also throughout generations. Because when you just die, then you're not really alive. Things that die are not really alive to begin with.
Thing is broken. Whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. So spontaneously generating things are not completely alive. They're not part of what we talk about when we talk about alive things. Mm-hmm. He just like gives this. He always has this like way of like just pushing away the cases that don't match into his thing. But I think it's trying to make sense. You could argue with it, but he's trying to show like what you mean when you say something alive, at least, or what the world means, what the nature means, is not something that's a mushroom, or somehow comes out of the ground for no reason.
Does he at any point make room for like, I guess things?
Those things exist, and they have some kind of. I mean, he's not saying they don't exist. The opposite.
Do they have souls?
Yeah, of course they have souls. What does it mean to have a soul? They have a spontaneously generated soul, which is not really the kind of living soul that we're talking about, because it can't, like, in some sense, if like a mule that can't reproduce at all from the kind of thing it is really something missing with it. Yeah, but maybe it's like a whole kind of thing that only exists as a mutilation. So it's rachamasis.
But it doesn't do all the living things, or all the things.
No, that is the living thing. It's not the problem. Is that he wants reproduction to be the living thing.
Not growing.
Exactly, both.
Right. So
both. He explains why.
This thing is not fully living.
He explains why. He explains why.
Why doesn't he, let's say, split the two, make growing and reproducing separate things, and then there'd be a fourth level?
Because they're in some sense similar.
Because things have...
growing is sustaining yourself, and reproducing is sustaining yourself as a species.
Because I think because...
Also, it's a difference there, so I'm just saying you could argue there should be
by perception. Perception in some sense sustains... animals sustain themselves by perception, partially also, or it's involved in their growth.
Okay, I think because things have to go somewhere. If it goes nowhere, like it's just mushrooming and dying, then, well, what is that? He doesn't understand things like that.
It's
just like, don't exist. No, things that you can't understand.
It's not a fundamental category of reality, at least, that we can break things down.
Yeah, he's not looking. I think there's something like this. He's not looking for like to give like some kind of breakdown of the animal kingdom, like modern science. Just I want to have a nice list to fit everything in. He's trying to explain what life is. Like the modern analytic way would say, what we mean when we say life,
right.
And we definitely mean reproduction also. Well, is that like the?
So does to be for this to be the case? Maybe not.
Yeah, possibly yes. Possibly yes, because of his idea of life being something that sustains itself and something that does what it does. And if you need something else to do it, then you're sort of less alive, right? We discussed this once. Like if God has to make every baby be born, then it wouldn't be really life. Then there wouldn't be souls. Then everything would be mechanical. Everything would be artificial, right? And how is it now? Spontaneous generation is not really because it's just a random. It does come from somewhere. That's why it's not really. It's just not explained enough, and we don't have the context to see this. That's all. That's I think what he would say. I'm not sure what he says in these. He has books about this.
Reality that's not so critical to understanding reality as a whole that this could fit into, right?
No, it is. It is. It does have to fit into
Categories to
because there's
understand?
nature, but nature always he generally always I don't know the exact answer to this, but he generally always thinks that nature has exceptions, and that doesn't bother him because he's not looking to because of his way of thinking. He's trying to explain what it means.
But the
He's not trying to
clouds and
explain.
stuff.
Yeah, he's very happy with nature having its Menachlai. He thinks that it's natural. It's natural because of there's reasons. Yeah, there's reasons for that. And he's not looking to absolutely sort of explain things. He's looking to explain what it means. And what it means is this.
He's okay for something that's not living to grow. That's okay.
Of course. I mean, mountains grow and they're not alive.
Right.
We discussed that once.
That's right. I didn't know that they grow.
Of course. Ant hills grow. I mean, they grow bigger, not in a live way. So the
Right.
same thing. Maybe
not?
spontaneous
But mushrooms
generating
become
thing.
bigger from itself, right?
Yeah, but not in the same way as do because they don't reproduce themselves. So they don't have this thing. We just if you just look at it as definition, then it's for sure like this.
Uh-huh.
This thing that we call something that's alive, that can exist, can sustain itself, that's not a mushroom. Well, in some sense it does because there's always mushrooms. So if you have a different kind of lens, then maybe it might be. But he never too worries too much about exceptions. And there's like a basic logic in doing this. So when you worry too much about exceptions, then you look for a different kind of explanation, and you end up not being able to make sense of anything. Just tell me what normal living thing. Okay, we'll talk about the abnormal ones later. Maybe there's something that broke them. Maybe mushrooms somehow Malach broke them. Otherwise, we're not going to understand anything. That's at least one of his thoughts. There might be other thoughts, but it all goes down to him looking to explain things and not just to say them. And if you look to explain things, you're going to have to do this. So otherwise, you can always find some broken thing that doesn't work that way. You say, who decides what's broken, right? That's always a problem. You said I'm broken, I'm not broken. I'm just differently abled. Well, that's fine. But that's not what we mean when we talk about ability of humans. No, it's serious. That's a real question. But then you just don't, then ability means nothing. That's the problem they will tell you. If everything is just differently able, then ability doesn't have a meaning. Then you're just telling me that nothing means nothing, and there's no such a thing as humans, and there's no such a thing as life. And then I'm going to ask you all my questions, which were my first questions to begin with. Could you explain me what life is? Well, there's no such a thing. Well, that's not what I asked you to do. You're just throwing me out of yeshiva instead of answering my question.
Is it possible that things that let's say a mushroom or spontaneous generation, because they need something else to do it, it's sort of an unnatural life, the same way we had this.
Yeah, they're not life. They're not natural.
The distinction between natural and unnatural objects is natural objects do the thing that they do.
They're just less alive, according to the definition of life being something that lives itself, that lives. I mean, people nowadays don't understand why machines that move in similar ways to living things are not alive, because they're just not alive. And you say, well, who says? Well, you said. That's what life means. You want to change the definition? I mean to say it's not a definition that we just decided on. That's what life is. There's such a thing. There's such a thing as life in the universe, and what it means is that when you say, well, I created something that looks very similar, but doesn't do that definition at all. You say, you're just giving you semantics, not semantics. Because we started off by identifying this thing. We walked, like my story of walking in the forest and seeing things that are living and things that are not living. And they were telling me, well, I could make you a nice picture which seems to be that. But then you didn't tell me that. Okay, we can get too stuck on this. The point is, and that's a whole different, that's like, again, we keep on arguing with them. We have to first listen to people sometimes. Okay? And that's the natural thing. So the natural function of living things are the things that when they're perfect, means they're complete, right? Because babies, at least as long as they're not mature, they never reproduce. That's part of how you see that reproduction is the aim of living things, because they all get mature and then reproduce. In other words, that's what complete living things are for. That's what they're doing. And it produces something like himself, and it's always something like themselves, right? An animal produces an animal, a plant. Everyone produces what he is. In other words, what kind of life he is, right? There's very specific. We can go down to very specific. An ant is an ant, and a zebra is a zebra, and so on. And he gives it another reason. Like, why do they do this? In order that they may partake of the everlasting and divine, insofar as they can. For all desire that. And for the sake of that, they do whatever they do in accordance with nature. So here is Platonism. Direct Platonism. Everything wants to be like God. That's what nature means. Nature is wanting to be like God. In accordance with nature. The Hanhaga, or the direction of nature is trying to be like God or like the everlasting. And everyone is trying to do that as much as he could. This is like Plato tells us this story from the other direction, right? And Timaeus says God or the demiurge wanted to create something as perfect as himself and couldn't, so ended up creating something that copies it or images it in some way. He wanted to make something timeless, so he made endless time. That was Plato's idea of time, or the soul. That's a different discussion. But Aristotle is saying something similar. Just he never likes to tell the story from God's perspective, from that kind of. He thinks that that's myth speaking, and just. But he says that it's nature always wants to be, right? Not because this is like again something very, trying to go down to very basic. Because what it means to be alive is that it is alive. It's for being alive. We can say they desire, but desire, just to be very clear, desire doesn't mean there's like some chemical firing in the brain of the rabbit that tells it to make more rabbits. That might be how it happens, but that's not what it means when you say desire. It's the opposite. Human desire is just a case of things by nature having ends, right? Because the explanation of everything, which is why nature has a kind of intellect in it, or it's a kind of intellect. Because the explanation of nature, the explanation of things is always, you can't explain anything, according to Aristotle, without saying what it's for, which is another way of saying what it desires. So you don't need a faculty of desire, that's very clear. He thinks this is true of everything.
So if you resort to, let's say, and you say it's a chemical in the brain, the chemical in the brain that wants you to do what?
Well, chemical, they might not want anything, but they want to have their own things. They might want to fall down and go up. But the person, the human being, wants to be forever. Not because someone told me to want to be forever. That's what humans want. Just in the same way that cheers want to be cheers. That's the only thing that everything wants to be what it is. That's the basic idea. Things don't want to be something different. They always want to be what they are. Because that's what it means to be a thing. What it means to be a thing is to sort of be that thing. Now, natural things, or living things, nature in general has change in it, which means they don't start off always by being what they are. They always becoming what they are. Things that are always what they are the divine things. They're the gods and things like that.
Artificial things also, in the extent that they exist, but they don't really exist.
Yeah, of course. They're always trying to perpetuate themselves. Everything is trying to perpetuate itself. Not in some kind of fight, people wanting. That's just what it is. A table is going to be a table for as long as it could. Isn't that true? Doesn't even try. Like, it's not like working hard. That's what it means to be a table. So and if you don't say that, you're missing out on what a table is. That's what his basic reasoning is. This is metaphysics, but like if you don't say a table is something that's trying to be a table, then you don't explain tables. You explain pieces of wood and pieces of wood configured in different ways, and when you add enough configured in different ways, you basically said this.
So basically, whatever sort of reason you would say why a person wants to live, it doesn't take away the fact that those reasons.
Life wants to live, not people want. People also want to live. That's because they have intellectual self. We're not up to that.
They're superfluous. They're not relevant to this.
We're not talking about people now at all. We're talking about the nutritive soul, right? There are broken. It's possible that the nutritive soul is what causes many people to want to live. They could be broken, and then you're depressed and you don't want to live. But those would be medical problems, not not psychological problems. In some sense, of course, there could be psychological problems also, but that's because people have higher faculties. But the basic thing of being alive is wanting to be alive. It's the same thing, because otherwise being alive means nothing. And being alive, now he takes that one step further and says that being alive is wanting to be alive forever. Everything wants to be forever. There doesn't seem to be something to stop it wanting that. The only thing that stops it is sort of necessity. It can't. Why can't it? He says, skip the parentheses for a second. He says, since. Why can't they? They just can't. So they find this a workaround. That's what reproduction is. See, that's what it's for. In other words, remember our four causes. This is the final cause of reproduction. The final cause of the. He says that's for the sake of it, just twofold. The purpose of which and the beneficiary of whom. I'm going to skip this for a second. Since then, they cannot share in the everlasting and divine by continuous existence. Why? They can't. Because no perishable thing can persist numerically one and the same. So basically because he's made out of matter. And which means he's a mortal thing, he's a perishable thing. And because he's a perishable thing, he can't exist as what he calls numerically one, being identical to itself forever, which is what he would want. It's trying its best, the soul, to be numerically one forever.
Something that's like it?
1 second, yeah. It can't. That's just because of it being made out of more things. That's basically his reasoning. So it's made out of matter and which has change in it, so at some point it's going to have to change. it's made out of
Why
more
doesn't
than one kind of
then
matter.
make the same as itself? Like,
Yeah, it
or
can't.
copy?
It can't because it's just has this necessity called matter. And matter is potential, and potential means it can change. And if it can change, it will change. That's Aristotle's basic way
but
of
not
thinking.
so much as to be something else.
Yes, it will be something else. It will
But
stop
it
it. Not
won't be a
it
cat.
will stop existing. No, it will be worse than that. It will stop existing
No,
entirely.
what I'm saying is humans
The
don't
individual
give birth to
humans,
cats ever,
yes,
right?
but individual humans cannot by definition of what they are be forever, or individual cats, numerically one
forever
cats.
as a species.
One second, I'm talking about individual ones. What's
Okay.
numerically one? Numerically one, it just means when you count them, 1, 2, right? That's what it means. If I count cats, this one cat cannot be the same one cat forever. That's not what being a cat means. Again, he's always going to say things like this. Being a cat, which means belonging to the order of that mortal things and changing things. So therefore, you can't be the same cat forever. But what he can do, they share in them as far as each can, some more and some less. They try to live as long as they could, but what persists is not the thing itself, but something like itself. Not one in number, but one in species. So he has this idea of there being different meanings of identity. Right? That's what one means here. Being identical to itself. You could be identical. So I could say, in other words, when I go around, I say, I can go around and say, this is the same thing. There's the same, like I am the same thing as myself, or I'm the same thing as I myself was yesterday, right? Or I could say I'm the same as you. Those are the same word, the same. They're both identity statements. I'm the same as you, but they have different meanings. And Aristotle loves saying that same word has different meanings. There's different meanings of one. I could say I'm one. I'm the same. Really means the same, or identity. I'm the same as you. Well, not numerically, meaning we could count us as two. We count us as two. There's one person, two people, but we're both people. So, and if we're standing next to cats, we'll say there's people and there's cats. That these are the same and those are different. So there's a certain sameness or a certain unity or a certain identity between all people. There's only one kind of person, right? We can count a lot of people, not numerically one people, but there's only one species of humanity, according to Aristotle. Some people think there's more.
Is this species eternal?
Yeah, all species are eternal. Well, that's because of eternity of the universe and whatnot. But yeah, species can be eternal. According to Aristotle, eternal, perpetual is actually the correct word.
Okay.
They can exist forever,
Some
meaning
species don't though. We can kill all of them. Right?
that's a kasha. Again, I don't care about that. You could kill. There's problems. People, for Aristotle, this has to do with metaphysics and physics, not really with us all. Of course, it has to do also. People say, well, we now know that species can go extinct. There's all kinds of taritzim for this kasha.
We knew that species go extinct before we knew that species went extinct already.
It seems that they could. That he thought that they can't
You
actually.
could also kill. Yeah, Aristotle didn't think you could kill all the cats.
No, you can't kill all the cats. They'll run away. No, it makes sense, by the way, what he's saying. What cats do all the time is make sure that not all the cats get killed. That's what cats are for. Even evolution says this, right? That's biology. Life cats, the whole tachlis of being a cat is to make sure there are some cats always. The same thing as human. The same whole tachlis of being a human is, at least for the biological part, or the nutritive part of human, is to make sure there's always humans. So you say, could I kill all of them? Well, it seems to be logically possible, but cats will run away. Yeah, their whole point is to run away before you kill the last cat, and to make another cat be born before that. Could someone sort of kill every cat? He thinks that's probably metaphysically impossible also. That seems to be wrong in reality.
It's not a steer at all. Cats.
But the point, the big point is that not if it's possible. He does think, at least he says that it's impossible. But it's not such a big kasha, because that's, like you're saying, it's not his point. He's trying just to explain you that cats are for making sure there's always a cat. There's always some cats. And they're not making sure Mr. Cat, or whatever the cat is called, is existing, because that's impossible, and people don't want to do impossible things. This is why, according to Aristotle, nobody wants to live forever. Very interesting. At least, maybe your intellect wants to live forever, and it does. But no animals want to live forever. No humans, insofar as they're mortal beings, or insofar as their nutritive souls, want to live forever. You sort of want, but you can't. In other words, you tend toward that, but the way you do it, you don't really even try, because that would be irrational. And nature doesn't do irrational things. Nature has an order always. What it does is, like we're just saying, it tends towards eternity, which means it perpetuates itself in species. That's what it does. It grows, and then it has babies. And then that way it lives forever. It always lives forever, but only in species, not in individual. Not in numeric, not in number. That's what he says. In species and not in number. In other words, it's identical to itself. It's the same. I'm the same as my child because I'm a human and he's a human, but I'm not the same in the being numerically one. That's his language. Right? It might probably means being made out of the same piece of matter or something like that. But that's the whole machlok is how exactly the individuals of a species are cut off from each other. But the way he says it is that they're quantitatively different. They're numerically different. That's what life is for. That's not what nutrition is for. What nutritive soul is for. It's for being like God by existing as forever. Another word for existing, right? Because not existing forever is less existence. It's not really another thing.
Does he see the existence as a species just as good as some sort of
it's a good thing.
numerical? No, I'm saying is it like a b'diavad or
it's b'diavad in the way he puts it down here. It's not b'diavad because if it would be a b'diavad, it wouldn't. I mean, it's b'diavad in the sense of like you could imagine being a god, but you can't be a god. So it's like a lot of b'diavad. Like humans should have wanted to fly, should be able to fly, but they can't fly. By the way, they still can't fly. Although the Wright brothers invented airplanes, humans still can't fly. I have news for you. People keep on using this example for some weird reason. Humans still can't fly, as far as I know. Humans can make machines that fly and get in those machines. Yeah, that's nice. They still can't fly. It's still sad. Like mi yitan li avei kayona is still true, in the literal sense. It would have been better. Humans can imagine it would be better for them to be able to fly. Well, you can get on a plane. Thank you very much. Everyone knew that you can jump off a tall building and fly.
You want to fly like Superman.
Yeah, exactly. No, as humans, that's the imagination.
Right.
The imagination is to fly as a human. Like
Superman's
just
not special because he gets into a machine.
well, doesn't he have some kind of wings or
Not a
something?
human.
What?
He doesn't fly with some kind of wings. Just
No,
fly.
No, he just flies.
He's not a human. What is he? A malach? He's a god.
He's a god, yeah.
Whatever.
No, he's not a god. He's from a different planet. He's a different
Okay,
species.
maybe gods come from
Oh, it's different
planets.
species.
I don't know.
Okay, but kids said, yeah, I'm asking humans. I'm just saying, so this. I'm just saying it's sort of like I say. No, so this is why the answer. We'll go back. No, Chazon. We're going back. This is this parentheses is trying to answer this question. I'm not entirely sure what the answer is. The parentheses said that for the sake of which means it has two meanings. You could say the purpose of which, and it says here the beneficiary for whom. And what this means is these two things. In other words, when we talk about final causes, there's internal final causes and external final causes, and that's interesting. In other words, in some sense, we say God is what. This is interesting. God or eternity, right? The eternal, the divine, whatever exactly that means, is what perpetuates species. And if you realize, Aristotle is saying this is true, but not because of God doing something, but because of things tending towards God. We had this discussion in general, but here he's talking about a very specific case, in the case of species perpetuating themselves. So God is the cause, but not an active cause, sort of what he calls a final cause, right? The cause in the sense of it being the thing towards which things are going. So since everything is tending or stretching itself or pointing or towards eternity, so there is eternity, right? Let's be clear, there is eternity, right? There are gods or a god, angels, whatever. The universe itself is eternal. The heavens are eternal, according to Aristotle. There are eternal things, or at least perpetual. There are everlasting things. I'm not sure if it says here everlasting. It's which one? But you could. There are everlasting things, and those everlasting things are the cause, in one sense, of species being forever, of you having babies. So it's actually God having. In other words, if you want to be poetic, you can say things like, it's God that makes everyone have babies. This mufteach shel chaya, bi'adak tishbache. Because the only reason things have babies is because they have this need or this tendency towards, like I keep using this word, but they have this tendency towards being complete, which means being as complete as the God. And therefore, it's God that makes things have babies. In other words, if there wouldn't be eternity in the universe, then there wouldn't be any problem with things just stopping to exist. Well, the whole world wouldn't work then, so that's a different problem. But that's what. So in some sense, the eternity itself is the soul. In other words, is the final cause of the soul reproducing. So all reproduction goes back or goes towards, right? Goes towards.
God causes it by being Meshach Navi.
Exactly. Sort of. This is the image, but yeah, you have to try to take away these images. But it causes it by them wanting to be like him, not by him telling them something or sending them some power or something. Well, this is a kind of sending power, but we think of it as backwards, right? It's in the future, not in the past. It's in the something like that. It's in front of you, not back of you.
Destination
These are all
everything.
images that I have. Yeah, it's a destination. And so that's one thing. And then there's another thing when we say the cause of, because of, the purpose for, which is the soul itself. We say the soul wants to perpetuate itself, or the species, and every soul is the soul of a species in some sense anyways. Well, we can get into discussion if there's such a thing as like a universal, if their species exist. But at least the human soul is not my soul, the nutritive soul at least. Maybe there's some. Aristotle definitely doesn't really care about the particular humans in general. He's a scientist and he always only cares about the universal, because that's the form of the human. The form of human is not the form of Yitzchok, it's the form of humanity, right? So the nutritive soul is the species, and there, in that sense, it's for itself, right? So you say, what is the goal of the soul? What is the end of the soul? Again, remember that this is all, and is going to make it explicit in the next piece. This is all him thinking of his famous four causes, right? So everything is, when we answer the question of why things happen, right? Four cause mean just because, say, right? Things are because of four different reasons. One is when we answer what it's made out of, right? That's not the soul. Souls are made out of bodies, which have potential to be souls and so on, but that's not the soul. We say what moves it, right? That's what's called an efficient cause, a moving cause, so sort of what's pushing it, or what's changing it, all kinds of different ways, right? Then we have the essence, what is it? That's called the formal cause, right? And then we have the final cause, or what is it for, right? And sometimes these are different things.
What do you mean?
Sometimes, in some sense, sometimes these are different things. In other words, the final cause of a table is that I should sit on it. So it's not really the table that's the final cause of itself. It's serving something else as its final cause. A table is for the idea that I have that I'm going to sit by it. And as long as I don't...
It's a natural object? Is that why it's like that?
Because it doesn't have a soul. Souls are the things that are their own final causes and their own essences and their own movers. Everything else...
Cause?
What?
What's a rock's final?
There's complications about this. Aristotle sometimes thinks that rocks are for people to walk on and things like that. I think that what he's getting at here is that there's different meanings of that word. At least when he talks about the soul, this is important to him, that the soul is its own final cause. In one sense only, that's what I'm saying. In one sense. There's in one sense which eternity is the final cause of the soul, or God is the final cause of the soul, because that's what it's trying to be. All the souls trying to be God. I keep on saying trying to be. Figure it out. But in another sense, it's itself. In other words, its own perpetual existence, its own species existence is what is the cause. Is its final cause.
What the formal cause kind of depends on
The final cause. The formal cause and the final cause is the same thing also. But that's always true. Almost always.
Depend on how wide you want to contextualize it, right? Meaning,
it's complicated.
In a local way, I want.
It's complicated. There are definitely some ways. That's what right here. What he's saying right here is definitely that their soul has two final causes, in itself and outside of itself. And you could sort of call the divine the soul of everyone, if you want to talk that way, but that wouldn't be speaking precisely.
What, into an internal and external final cause?
Yeah, it says that's again. This is me making what he says in simple language more complicated. That for the sake of which, now and again, we have this question every time you want to explain me something. I have to ask you again. That's for the sake of which is also too complicated. What is it for? Okay, if your kid brings you something home from school, some weird thing, you can ask him a bunch of questions. How did you make it? What is it made out of? Who told you to make it? Those are the first three causes. Then he's saying, what is it for? Well, it's a kite. It's for flying. Okay, so now I know what it is. By the way, you remember that what is it for and what is it? It's almost the same thing.
So the formal cause and the final cause
are the same. They're always almost the same thing. Not sometimes. They're always almost the same thing. But you could say the final cause is the completion of the what it is. It's
it's a kite
for being
it's not flying.
Yeah, and then it's like it's a kite, but it's not being a kite. So it's for being a kite is for being a kite, but it's they define each other. They're almost the same thing. It's very important. Remember, the only thing that's really different is the what it's from, or the efficient cause is different because that's the process of how it became what it is. But the formal cause and the final cause are almost the same thing, or sometimes literally the same object, or sometimes they at least define each other for sure. What I'm saying is.
Is this kind of what we mean when we say that we want to talk about the knower and the thing known?
Wait, we're gonna get to that another time. Wait, we're up to talking about having babies. We want to know what having babies is, or what the nutritive soul is. Nutritive having babies is for why do you have babies? Okay. But another way of saying why are you alive, right? And we just said that one of the things that we mean when we say being alive is why do you keep yourself alive, your species alive, okay? And I say, why do you do that? For what are you doing it? Right? For what is it? What is it for? That's his question. What is having babies for? Some guys say, it's a mitzvah, it says in the Torah, okay. That's just the, I don't know what that is. Okay, could be a lot of things. But we're talking nature here, right? What are ants having babies for, right? Forget about humans, which are complicated. Ants have babies for two things. One is for ants. I can answer that in one way. I can answer it in two different ways. That's the very simple meaning of when he says there's that two. And then if you like a philosophy, say, okay, there's two causes. But it's just saying you can answer this in two ways and they'll both be true. You just have to not confuse them. Right? I could say ants are for ants. They're having babies, so there always be ants. So it's for the ant soul. What is the for? What is it for? What is ants reproducing for? Or in other words, what is the reproductive soul or the nutritive soul? Same thing. Of ants for? Or what is it? It's for ants. So that's the beneficiary of what he calls the beneficiary of home here. For who is it? Who is the person who is the thing that it's for? It's for ants. But I could say, what is the purpose of that? Why do ants want to be ants forever? Why are they not happy with just there being one ant and it having died and finished? Well, that's because of God. Because of eternity. Because of divine. So just answering two kinds of questions. It's not really it's not a contradiction. You have to remember, this is one of my whole drushes that I have to say one time clearly. That the reason everyone is confused is because they think that everything only has one cause. And things have thousands of causes. It's obvious. And thousands of different kinds of causes. So God does everything and we do everything. It's not even a kasha. You don't have to do ayahuasca to understand that.
There's two parts to the final cause here?
There's two meanings to the word final cause, yeah.
And there's always two meanings?
At least there could be, yeah, often.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Here he seems to make it a general. Again, we could get into differences. Does the soul have a different kind of final cause? Is the soul different? Or material thing? We have to get into all these discussions. But at least it's possible for it to be to mean two different things. Yeah, I can mean what is it for, and I can mean who is it for. That's sort of the two things that he says. What is it for?
Isn't it what is it for and why is it for?
Yeah, you could say why. Same thing. Why is it for? Yeah, it makes sense.
What is for?
Why is it for? Why?
What is it for is to be eternal. Why is it for?
The thing that it's for. That's what we're saying. The thing that it's for is for itself. Okay. Everything is for itself, in this sense. Okay. That why is the itself have this need, right? Let's look really just going one step beyond and saying the same question. They say why do ants want to be ants? Why forever? Well, the answer is because they want to be like God, and God is forever. And sadly, ants can't be forever in the same way as God is, but they can be forever in the way that ants can be forever, and that's fine. That's perfectly fine. They're not sad about it. That's to be clear. They're not sad about it, all right? Because that's the proper way for ants to be forever is for it always to be ants. So everything in time is like this. Everything that's perishable and so on is like that. It's not sad.
And that is its movement that goes like this, whatever.
That's goes.
Its eternal motion.
Right? Yeah, the species it perpetuates itself. There's always ants having babies of other ants, and there's no chicken and egg question. There were always chickens. There was always eggs becoming chickens. There was no first egg. But that's just his theory. But I'm just saying that the chickens always want to lay eggs to make more chickens. And that's different than God, because God doesn't have to lay eggs to stay God. That's the big difference between everything else and God, or I don't know about everything else, between perishable things and gods. Gods don't have to have babies to stay God. They don't have to copy themselves, because they just stay by themselves. They're just standing there. And everything else has to do that. But that's just what it is. It shares in this kind of eternity, kind of thing. But what he's saying, again he's thinking of from the perspective of the thing. The thing wants to stay itself, wants to be itself. That's what things are for. All things. Anyways, yeah. So now we understand sort of. What do we understand actually? Is this like the object of reproduction? The object of reproduction is itself. Is the babies? Maybe. I'm not sure. What time is it? Did we do enough of this?
Is the reason why reproduction generally is more than one because it's this purpose? Because it's not just.
What do you mean more than one?
Why
people have more than one baby?
If ants laid one egg, you would say that they want to they do want a species more they just want to have just themselves, not so much for the species, almost want to like replicate themselves once, but because for the species they want to do multiple to make the species exist. It's that, like, the nature of the reproduction is like to make a species basically, not just
yeah, but species. When he says species, there doesn't need to be a lot for this.
No,
I mean,
know,
maybe that's just how survival, because there's a lion is going to eat some of the sheep, so we need a lot of sheep for one sheep to survive.
But it tends towards like a species. That's what
But when he thinks of species, he's thinking of it spread out on time. Like there's always a father and a son, and a father and a son, and a father and a son forever, and that's a kind of eternity that species have. In other words, they stay themselves. They stay the same in species, not in number. There's true that things have a lot of babies, yeah, but that's, I mean, some things. I don't know, not all things. I don't think it has to do, because again, he's thinking of like the whatever, everything. Again, there's a nature of it. He's not interested in biology, and he's interested in that in general, but not in this book. He's just trying to explain the principle of it, right? What is the thing that causes this to be passable? What makes it possible for things to continue to be themselves in some way? That's really the puzzle that he's wondering about. If you don't care about that question, which is like Manstein says, I don't know, just have babies, then the whole question doesn't start. It's only if you think that that's like something you should wonder about. You should, like, why is this? Like, where did it come from? Well, who gave them this idea? Who gave nature this idea? That's like sort of the kind of questions that he has. Okay. Anyways, is that enough?
I guess it's a question about final cause in general, but how do we know like when to stop? Like why is it any better to say that it does something because it wants to be eternal than to say it does something because it does something or whatever? I'm saying, what makes something the final cause?
No, final doesn't mean the end. Doesn't mean the last one.
Purpose.
Yeah, it's the for. Right. It just means the for cause.
But doesn't every
final is a bad translation from Latin.
Doesn't every for
the for
cause have another for? Like, is there eternal?
Sometimes yes. No, the regress problem is a general problem. That's a problem for everyone. This is not coming to solve that problem. You see, and he's not always worried about. Firstly, for certain things, he just says they're forever, and therefore we don't have whatever. They're in some way they're forever. But that's not the point. That's not what. Again, this is what important. His causes are not. They're not here to explain why things are in general. That's true, but they're also not. They just want to explain what it means for things to be. Forget about. I'm not trying to explain how it started. That's a different question. And it's seriously a different question for him. You can ask me, why is there the first chicken bichlal? He might have an answer for that, but that wouldn't be this answer. And maybe he'll say, I don't have an answer for that. Some people will, some Aristotelians at least will tell you that we don't need an answer for that. That question is illegitimate. Whatever. They just say it's not where we're interested in understanding. We're interested in understanding things that we could understand. And what this answer of like giving all these end causes and forms is not there to stop the explanation cause. It's just there to make sense of the thing that's in front of your eyes. That's the whole thing of all of these things. Like, just explain me this table, then we'll explain why there's tables in the universe. I'm not up to that. Just explain me, because he thinks that the local explanation doesn't work without this. It's not that we're stopping. He's asking me, why is it for? It's true. Sometimes he agrees that there's sometimes chains that go on for a long time. Sometimes it's easy to explain those chains. Sometimes it's hard to explain. Okay. And then maybe when you get to the end, you'll bump into a different problem. Those are different problems. He's not worried about those problems. He's not like doing the cosmological argument and like who gave birth to whatever. That's not his issues generally. The reason he gets to these four causes is just to explain one thing. He says if one change, even one step in the world needs all these to make sense. This is not another step. The four causes are not steps. They're all the same, simultaneous. They're not one before the other. That's why these translations are very bad. Final cause, and I say it like it's after. Final cause just means the end, or the for. What is for? Final is from Latin, and it doesn't have the same connotation in English. Sometimes say the end, or the. In Hebrew they say tachlis, which is also not good enough. But anyways, in the completion, you could say all kind of things. It's not in time. It's not like about, so why is this, and then I ask you why is that. No, it's the first time I asked you all these four questions. He said, when you ask me what is going on, you ask me all these four questions at once. So then you have to every time answer all of them in order to make sense of one step. Then you ask me, the next step question is the same thing. You have to have those four in this next step, and you'll figure it out. And then you might get stuck in the chicken and egg question. That's a different problem. That's not what the four causes are here to solve. Yeah. Yeah, that's the story with this.
Whew, this is
10:20.
Very focused.
It was okay today?
highly focused.
Very good. We're trying to do our campaign for things. So
Yeah.
the final cause of whatever,
Oh.
the material causes of our base medrash need to be sustained too, and whatever.
I'm not sure if the efficient causes are here.
We have to. That's why there's chains. Everyone has to whatever, do what we could. Anyways.